welcome into the 14. I'm your host, Chris Lee. Joining me, as always, my co-host, Blake Lovell. Blake, it is cold outside. We got about 3 more inches of snow in the Nashville area last night. Everything shut down for a while, including maybe some baseball, unfortunately. And some basketball is going to be shut down tonight as we speak. We're doing this Thursday morning. Some games were supposed to be played. But between that, we got in a couple of basketball games last night, and I don't know that anything much changed coming out of this, but certainly 2 interesting contests in their own way.
Yep, they were for sure, Chris. And like you said, we were really excited the other day, weren't we, about the afternoon SEC basketball slate here on Thursday. And unfortunately, we won't be getting that, but we did get 2 interesting games, like you said, in their own right, I think, in terms of the outcomes and what you take away from them. Again, I don't think you certainly learn a whole lot from those 2 games we saw on Wednesday night, but still, I think two noteworthy performances probably just in terms of how those games finished and how they played out.
Let's start with Tennessee. It was not a surprise that the Vols beat South Carolina. Maybe the 20-point margin was a surprise. I don't think either of us were expecting that. But 2 big happenings in that game for the Vols. We have talked about John Fulkerson a lot and his lack of scoring. He erupts for 19 points and 6 boards in 30 minutes, goes 7 of 12 from the field, 5 of 7 from the line. But maybe the bigger story, Victor Bailey Jr., who I think led Tennessee in scoring for maybe the first 4 or 5 games and has sort of become, I don't want to say a non-factor, but certainly secondary to Keon Johnson and Jaden Springer and sometimes Santiago Vescovi among the perimeter guys in that offense. But he erupts for a career-high 29 points in 32 minutes last night, takes 16 shots, hits 9 of those, 7 of them three-pointers. But I think if you are Tennessee, it's not just the fact that you get the win, but how you get the win that was encouraging.
Yeah, I found the stat for Victor Bailey here, of course, who he came over from Oregon. They expected him to be, the sharpshooter that they needed to improve their three-point shooting. And like you said, he had a strong start to the season, but since, like many on Tennessee's roster, which we've talked about, it's been kind of up and down in terms of what he's done on offense. And he scores 29 against South Carolina on Wednesday night. I think the previous 6 games, he scored a combined 32 points. And then the previous game against LSU, he didn't score at all. So I think that's kind of shows you, just in terms of the inconsistency at times, like we talked about with Tennessee. That stat sort of proves it, where you have a guy who didn't score the last game and really hadn't scored, all that much the previous several games. But then he comes out and scores 29 here and is able to hit 7 threes, and that's what you want. Like, we were talking about the shooting aspect earlier in the week, weren't we, about what you could do to kind of separate yourself if you're a team that's struggling on offense. Having a guy who can just knock down shots from the perimeter is always going to be something that could really help you, and Tennessee got that in this one. I had made this my prediction, Chris. I know you remember this was going to be perhaps my rock fight of the week, but it turned out that Tennessee's offense puts up 93 points, which is not something that probably we expected from this group. I want to say that's only the second or third time maybe they've hit 90 this season. But it's one of those things where, as we've said, it's just it's a team that can build on its defense, but when they have offense like this, they are good enough to play with anyone in the country. And I know South Carolina struggled, but at the same time, when you see this Tennessee team play like this, when you're getting contributions from guys like Victor Bailey, it shows you what they're capable of. And I think for Tennessee fans, they just want to see that more often.
To answer your question, the Vols had not hit 90 since way back before conference play started. Actually, Tennessee exceeded 100 points in 2 straight games, one against an awful Tennessee Tech team and the other one against a pretty poor St. Joe's team. But, yeah, we saw offense from Tennessee early in the season that we had not seen really since. And, again, much has to do with the level of competition. But one thing that I saw Tennessee doing in that game last night, which I thought was a really good move by Rick Barnes, Tennessee really got out on the break. They would rip down a rebound and get an outlet pass and really get it going in transition. I have seen South Carolina have some issues defending that this year in terms of just not getting back, which is not what you would expect out of a Frank Martin team. But when you've got guys on offense who are struggling, a good way to get them going is to get them easy buckets. And I thought Tennessee did that on Wednesday evening.
Yeah, it seemed like they had a pretty, disciplined approach in terms of how they were going to go about this and attack South Carolina, like you said, seeing some of the weaknesses that team had, and it's certainly worth pointing out too. And I think this South Carolina team not having Jermaine Couisnard or not having Justin Minaya, a little bit of a different setup, I think, for them because those are two guys that certainly play a role in their success, but I just think it was the kind of performance that Tennessee needed. They were not playing particularly well halfway through that first half. I know South Carolina had the lead there probably with about 8 minutes or so, I think, to go in the first half. And then just kind of the way the game played out from there, it was one where Tennessee kind of took control and really did what we thought they should do. And doing it without Josiah Jordan-James too, who is someone else, along with that young nucleus of Jaden Springer and Keon Johnson. He's someone that kind of has to play a role too on their offense. But for someone like Victor Bailey to step up, have the game he did, and to get the production you got from Fulkerson and Epons, who he only had 10 points, but he had 9 rebounds, and those are the kind of things. Those are the stats. Like they speak for themselves for this Tennessee team. When you get those guys producing, and you get a guy like Victor Bailey or pick someone else out, whether it's Vescovi, anyone else, stepping up and having a big game, that is always going to give this team a chance to win because their defense is pretty strong for the most part. And I just thought it was the exact type of game they needed, given some of the stuff we talked about here recently with them.
Well, one other encouraging stat, 26 assists for the Vols against just 16 turnovers. That is a good sign. A little bit of issue with ball security. And one of the bizarre stats, I cannot remember it exactly, but South Carolina is really creating a lot of turnovers, but what it gets from those is really not much. Carolina really having struggles producing points off turnovers. It gets 11 steals last night. It forces 16 turnovers, and it only gets 13 points off those.
Yeah, that is kind of a weird dynamic when you see how it plays out like that. But, and I mean, someone like Keyshawn Bryant, he had 7 turnovers, and that's something you never want. But also, as we said, when you have guys out, like a Couisnard and guys like that who regularly handle the ball more too, that's going to put some of these guys in a position where, they have to have the ball more, and it's going to lead to some of those times where you can have more turnovers and stuff like that. So this South Carolina team, I think at this point they're 5-10. We didn't really know how things were going to play out with them for a while there because they just had not played enough games. But now that we're seeing them here over the past several games and kind of what they've done outside of that game against Florida, I just think it's one of those teams where we could probably look at a lot of different things. And I do think, there is something to the fact that this team did not play for a month, and having to be off for a month in the middle of the season is just something where I don't know that they maybe had the dynamic with this particular group or have the roster that was able to kind of really get back on track after something like that. Because as we've seen since then, this team has just been really up and down and haven't guarded, like Frank Martin teams want to guard, and they've just given up a lot of points. So that hasn't helped either.
Well, you mentioned Carolina being without 2 starters, and what happened last night is that I think more of the scoring burden shifted to A.J. Lawson. He takes 20 shots in 28 minutes, which he is like their 3rd most used player, according to KenPom. Bryant and Couisnard actually get more use than he does in terms of using possessions. I think he's a really good player for them, but you look at the supporting stuff. Seventh Woods has 1 of 9 from the field. Just not a team when you're giving up 93 points. I don't think there's enough scoring firepower there for Carolina to hang with the team like Tennessee.
Well, and if you look at KenPom now, South Carolina's up to 8th in the country in adjusted tempo and average offensive possession length. They're 20th at 15.5 seconds. So this is a team that we've said it before about Frank Martin and kind of underrated or undervalued in terms of how fast he wants to play. But this is a team that's playing fast, but just is not efficient in doing so. And that's what I think is leading to them giving up a lot more points on the other ends because they're just not efficient enough on offense playing at this kind of pace. And so maybe this is just a group, that is just not meshed as well as he thought they would, being able to try to play this type of pace, that he wants to play.
Well, I guess the question is that how they need to play? I'm looking at their Final Four year, and they were 145th in tempo, which is about average. The next year, they're 153. The last couple of years, this year you mentioned they're 8th. They were 17th last year. It's just not something you expect out of a Frank Martin team. And I wonder if that suits him because he recruits all these hard-nosed kids, a lot of European and Canadian kids. And he just had a certain style that you think back to Kansas State, and you're not thinking run and gun and all these things. Now, maybe they thought that with the Final Four, that would expand their recruiting base and put them on the radar and maybe get them in the mix for more players. I don't know that that's happened, but I do wonder when I look at those tempo numbers, if that's the best decision for them, given what's worked for him in the past.
Yeah, I just pulled up because I was curious as you were talking about that, kind of what he did at Kansas State. And, the eighth, again, they're 8th this year in adjusted tempo. They were 17th last year. Those are the two highest he's had in his career. And even the 61 from, I guess, 3 years ago, that would probably still rank in the top 5 or 6, I think, because the two of his first 3 years at Kansas State, they finished 33rd and 36th in adjusted tempo in 2 of those seasons. Now, one of the seasons they won 29 games. That was the memorable season they got to the Elite Eight. And then, elsewhere, they kind of hovered around that 100 mark. And it seemed like that's kind of where maybe he's used to being because a lot of his South Carolina teams are in that 140, 150 type range like you talked about. But they really have, over these past couple of seasons, they have taken it to another level. And I'm sure there's, a reason behind that. But like you said, maybe it's something to where they want to play at that tempo. But for whatever reason, having these guys like A.J. Lawson and Kuznard and Keyshawn Bryant and Justin Minaya, I can understand why they would want to play that way. But as we're seeing, it's just, I don't know, it hasn't been as effective this season. But even though we have seen them be able to do it efficiently at times over the past couple of years.
Well, tempo is divided into two things. It's how quickly you use a possession on offense and how quickly you use one on defense. And, some of it, like I said, I've seen a lot of teams get some easy, fast break numbers against them this year where just they get beat down the floor for easy layups. It's not something you think of again with the Frank Martin team. Their components here are average possession league on offense, they're 20, defense, they're 65. I guess that the second one faster than you think, but I think that's one of the things. The other thing is when you're forcing turnovers, you're ending possessions maybe prematurely, just a few seconds in the shot clock. I'm spitballing here a little bit, but yeah, I don't know what's going on with them. I think, like you said, though, it's just been a disjointed season for them, and it just shows up. And from one night to the next, I mean, they can literally be awful one game and look really good the next. And I don't know what's going on there, but maybe it's just the stops and starts.
And the turnovers are what factored into, I think, when you go back to his Kansas State days. Like, they were so good at turning teams over. And again, it wasn't that they were just running up and down on offense at times, but they were just so good at forcing turnovers on defense that obviously played into kind of looking at those tempo numbers and such. But I don't know. Like I think they're at a point now, and we've talked about this and in the deep dive we did the other day on SEC basketball and maybe what Frank Martin's future is there. I don't know. I feel like that they are starting to maybe get to the point to where I feel like they need an identity on what they are doing each season, because I feel like it's one where it's almost like the one thing we've talked about the most with them is they lose non-conference games they shouldn't lose, but then they make their run in SEC play and everything is fine. I don't know if it's just consistency like we talk about with some of these other programs, but I don't know what it is, but I feel like that they're not, maybe, I don't know if they have that identity they had. Of course, during the Final Four run, it's easy to kind of talk about that, but I don't know. It feels like they're starting to move in a different direction. I'm not saying it's a bad direction, but I just think that they're starting to maybe do some things a bit differently and maybe try to play a bit differently than they have at times since he's been there.
Well, here's another thing. They've got one senior on the team, and
Yeah,
that's Seventh Woods.
right. Yeah, and I mean Mike Kotsar, like I don't, and I thought losing him like that was going to be something that, whether I don't know, like there were some things he could do on offense. There were also things he could do on defense, and I think just losing a guy that had that size, I don't think that helps either. Now look, he wasn't someone that was in the SEC Player of the Year race or anything like that, but I think by the time he started his career there, he's playing on that Final Four team, and then developed into a guy that really at 6'11", 270, 275, whatever, he became someone they could sort of rely on, whether it was, rebounding, defending, scoring points. Like he was pretty consistent in that role. So I feel like maybe losing him too, that they really haven't had an answer for how to replace him necessarily on this roster. And I think that's something to where they're probably playing faster, even though they played pretty fast with him last year. But they're playing even faster now, just maybe not having just a traditional big guy like that on the floor.
Well, you go back and look to the Final Four team, okay? And two things that really stand out. They had a guy in the middle that you just didn't want to mess with. You did not want to come into the paint and challenge him.
Yeah.
That's Chris Silva. You mentioned Kotsar, also a little bit more of a blue-collar guy, maybe not as skilled, but a big, tough-minded kid. And so, like, when you took the ball to them in the paint, you had to deal with those two guys. And then you also had Sindarius Thornwell, who, frankly, they've not had another guy quite like him since. And Thornwell just did everything, right? He was there on defense to get steals and blocks. He would score on offense. He used a lot of possessions. But I don't know. He probably, with that team, Frank Martin just hit a combination of kids that's probably not going to come along where the dominoes line up the way they did that year. And we've said this before, we think he's a really good coach, and they've been really consistent. But it was also kind of the right place, right time. Although you looked that year, they were 233rd in experience. So it wasn't your prototypical, team that really got old all at the same time, like you're seeing at Missouri this year. But they had a combo of players what just worked. And I think there's been a step down in talent from that team for sure.
Yeah, and we've said it before about the NCAA tournament, and this is not to knock, South Carolina, Frank Martin or anything, but it is. Like every NCAA tournament is different, and I think the teams that make the run, sometimes it's just about the matchups and it's about playing at the right time. Because I really I forget this, but I think back to watching that South Carolina team play in the SEC tournament that year. I guess it was probably here in Nashville from what I remember. That was the 2017 tournament, I think. They played a Friday afternoon game against Alabama, and they looked awful. Like they couldn't hardly do anything. They couldn't make shots. Alabama beat them by double digits, and I was just thinking, man, this team, you felt like that they should have been in a spot, and they still got a good seed because they finished 12-6 in the regular season in the SEC, but it's just one of those things where you could have never guessed that a team like that as a 7 seed, after what you saw from them in that SEC tournament game against Alabama, and really they finished the season pretty poorly. I think they lost 4 of 6 or something like that after they started 9-1 in SEC play. And it's just, I don't know, the NCAA tournament, I know we love to measure like success on the NCAA tournament. And I've said before, I think certainly at times that's unfair just to measure a coach based only on what he does in a random tournament. But at the same time, it's like, man, it's that was a really weird dynamic in terms of how that whole thing played out in the 2017 tournament.
Yeah, well, we'll be talking March Madness here in 3 or 4 weeks, and one thing we'll probably be talking about momentum, and that's overrated a lot of times. And that team is a good example. South Carolina lost 6 of its last 9 games heading into the NCAA tournament. Oh, by the way, it's 2 of its 3 wins in that were against Mississippi State, which was 88 in Ken Palm that year. So, yeah, and last 2 losses heading into the tournament. Carolina lost to Ole Miss, again, mediocre Ole Miss team by 5 points, and then to Alabama by 11, NIT-type Alabama team that year too. So it wasn't like they were losing close games to good teams. They were just kind of stumbling into the tournament. But you're right, it is sort of a random sequence of events, and Carolina had just all lined up for that team that year. But anyway, indeed, Alabama did go to the NIT that year. I just checked on it. But anything else on South Carolina, Tennessee before we move to Vandy, Kentucky?
I don't think so. I think it's just, for Tennessee, it's one game, and I think that they, what's next? I feel like that's really the only question with Tennessee is they win that game, and now as we'll transition to Kentucky and Vandy, what does Tennessee look like when they play Kentucky on Saturday?
Well, I guess the meaningful aspect is Tennessee back in that top 4.
Yeah, right.
Which is kind of where you want to be before the SEC tournament. Now, look, there's a lot of ways to go. And again, this has been the case for a couple of weeks. It's just really not a lot of separation. You've got Alabama 12-1. You've got Arkansas 9-4, LSU 8-4, then Tennessee 8-5. Then it goes to Florida 6-5, Ole Miss 7-6. You have got, just a lot of teams in that 5, 6, 7 win area. And I just think, again, we're going to be looking up a lot of tiebreakers here, I think, in 2 weeks when we get down to SEC tournament seeding.
Yeah, and we haven't been looking up tiebreakers when it comes to number of games played in a long time. So that's probably something, too. It's like, okay, where's that team? Oh, yeah, they haven't played enough. They haven't played this many games. And so that's something we'll have to figure out, too. So that won't be a lot of fun, probably.
Let's talk Vandy, Kentucky. Kentucky just gets off to a red-hot start, gets out 10-0. Vanderbilt doesn't score till about 4 minutes in, and Vandy just looked awful in the first half. Scotty Pippen Jr., I think, was scoreless and had no assists and maybe 4 turnovers, something like that. Got a technical or a flagrant one out of frustration. Vandy looked completely disjointed, then made that a game in the first 5 or 6 minutes in the second half, tied it with, I want to say, about 13 minutes to play. And, oh, by the way, Isaiah Jackson, who was Kentucky's best player in the first half, gets 4 fouls in that range, and Sarr picks up a third. So you're thinking, okay, Vandy played awful the first half. It's got all this momentum. Vandy tied the game, never took the lead. Kentucky held on and hit 24 of 25 from the line last night, which is a very un-Kentucky-like performance from the line. But that game ended up a lot more entertaining than I thought. I mean, Vanderbilt brought the definition of a rock fight offensively most of that first half, but that ended up being a really entertaining game in the end.
That is one thing I'll say about this Vanderbilt team, and we've talked about the struggles this program's had over the years, is I don't look at this team as one that I feel like is ever just going to be in a spot. And yes, they've lost blowout games before, but I don't know. Like there is sort of an edge to this team that I do like in terms of these guys and some of the things they're able to do in some of these games. Now, again, that's, moral victory type stuff. And if you're Vanderbilt, that's not what you want to be doing. But really, when you look at it, I had thought about this earlier. When you look at their losses in the SEC, they're what, 2-9 now, I think, in the SEC, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of those 9 are by single digits. And actually, I think 6 of those 9 are by 7 or less, I want to say.
I think they are 1-5 in games in the league decided by 6 points or less. I looked this up last night.
Yeah. So that's not that far away. But at the same time, this is certainly an opportunity that you probably would have liked to get, because this is a Kentucky team, as we talked about, that has struggled a bit. And I just thought, you can look back at what ifs, and you can do that with a lot of games throughout, the season. But to just get off to such a poor start, I think that was one to where, you're having to play from behind at that point. And when you find yourself constantly sometimes in that spot, you can only make up so much ground. And I thought at the end of it, it's just, Kentucky, that big start is what kind of helped them. And Vanderbilt, I don't think, ever actually led in the game, period. And so, I don't know, it was one of those where you felt like Vanderbilt had their opportunities, they had their chances. But like you said, believe it or not, surprisingly enough, Kentucky, the one thing that they've been okay at this season on offense is free throw shooting. I mean, they haven't been over the top great, shooting 72.8%. That's probably, I'd have to look at the rest of the SEC, but I have to assume that that's pretty good probably compared to other teams in the SEC, because that's another stat that I think has not been too kind to some teams in the SEC over the past several years. But they made their shots, they hit their free throws, they did what they had to do to close the game. And I thought there were positives on both sides, but really for Vanderbilt, the biggest thing was just not having that bad of a start. Then maybe that game plays out a little differently.
Well, let's table Vandy talk for a minute because there were some interesting storylines with that team. But Kentucky gets five guys in double figure scoring. Devin Askew has nine. And again, Jackson really, if it weren't for Dylan Disu, again, we'll get to him in a minute. I think he goes 15-7 in the first half or 13-7, something like that. And then second half, he gets in foul trouble and barely sees the floor. But what Boston starts the game off hot for them, we talked about how well he had done coming into this game. And I'm watching and thinking, okay, he's really going to kind of take over this game for Kentucky. Well, what happens is really after the first 5 or 6 minutes, he's not nearly as much of a factor. Jackson, again, gets into foul trouble, and in the second half is really on the bench more often than not. But you start seeing some supporting guys in Mintz and Jacob Toppin step up and give them just enough. Again, the free throws was the thing, but I thought Kentucky got enough scoring punch from other guys, which has sometimes been an issue, and that of the foul shooting was the difference.
Yeah, I thought that they really, played pretty well for the most part. Again, aside from just how things sort of unraveled there, and Vanderbilt made their comeback and all that stuff. But I thought it was a game where you could see, once again, we talk about potential of like a Tennessee on offense and what they're capable of. Like you could see that with Kentucky here, and I think it was one where just seeing the way the game played out, and to be able, once Vanderbilt actually tied that game with whatever it was, 14 minutes left, I think in the second half, and made that, the furious run out of halftime. I thought it was one where, for this Kentucky team in particular, we've seen, what was it? I think we actually talked about it yesterday. I said, when you get these kind of close games with Kentucky this season, it's so different because there are literally times where I'm thinking, I actually think Kentucky's probably going to find a way to lose this game versus normally I'm thinking, okay, Kentucky's probably going to find a way to win this thing. And so that is something that I think if you're John Calipari, you can at least use moving forward is, hey, these guys in a game like this where they had a big lead early, Vanderbilt rallies back, and all of a sudden it's tied. Vanderbilt's at home. It could have went in that direction, but yet Kentucky found a way to make the plays and to win that game. So you can build off of that. We know, what the season's been. There's no reason just to keep talking about it like they are what they are. I mean, their record is not great. And yet still, I think that there are moments like that, like they had in this game where Vanderbilt made the comeback and then Kentucky was able to close it out. I think that at least they can lean on that for a little bit of confidence moving forward.
Well, Scotty Pippen Jr. has been the guy that we have talked about with Vanderbilt all year, and I've said he's no doubt their best player. I'm starting to have some doubts about that. Let me give you some stats on Dylan Disu, who really probably doesn't get talked about a lot. I mean, when you're 2-9 and you've got a guy like Pippen, the ball's in his hands a lot. He's the second or third leading scorer in the league. Those are the guys that get the attention. But in league play only, Dylan Disu leads the conference in rebounding, 8.8 a game. He's fifth in scoring, just behind Pippen, 17.2. He is, maybe as importantly, fourth in field goal percentage at 52.2. By the way, some of those three-pointers, Dylan Disu is really making a charge. I don't know that he ends the year as Vanderbilt's best player, but he's starting to maybe make a case for it, because I think he's playing a few more minutes. And Pippen, we have said this before, he's got some games where his numbers are on volume, right? He was not good in the first half last night, and he winds up with 21 points, but it takes him 19 shots. He has 3 assists, but he has 5 turnovers. Disu has had some big turnover games too, but last night he goes career highs in points and rebounds, 29 and 16, plays 37 minutes, 34 seconds. That kid is really taking the next step for them.
He has, and we can have the larger debate about Vanderbilt and all that, but the one thing I will say is that you've seen guys like Scotty Pippen, Dylan Disu, like they have gotten better, and they have gotten to the level of, like you said, I mean, these are two guys who play at an all SEC type level. And I think that is something, if you're Vanderbilt and you want to take the positives out of this game and really want to take the positives out of this season, those are two things that you can still look at and say, hey, these players are getting better. Maybe not everyone on the roster is taking that type of leap, but you have guys like this who clearly have potential to be stars in the league, and they've kind of reached that potential. And like you said, maybe some of that's based on volume, but I think they've also just kind of improved their game to the point to where they've adjusted to life in the SEC. They got thrown into the mix last year, and now to kind of take that next leap as a sophomore, which is not always easy to do. You know, coaches always talk about the freshman to sophomore jump, and sometimes it's not easy to do that, but that's what they want. Like, they want you, if you get that experience as a freshman, to be able to take that next leap as a sophomore. And I think both of these guys have certainly been able to do that. And I think when you talk about Disu, I mean, it is like you can see out there on the floor, and look, going back to the star ratings thing, I mean, Dylan Disu, I think at times during that game, like, he was the best player on the floor at times. Even though Kentucky had all the balance and all this other stuff, he looked like the best player out there. And you're going up against the guys who are, 5 stars across the board and all this other stuff. So I think there's a lot more that goes into it. And I really do, again, we've talked about Jerry Stackhouse. We've talked about sort of the future of the Vanderbilt program. But if there is something you want to look at and say, I feel good about this, and maybe it's, I don't know what your confidence level would be, put a percentage on it or whatever. I mean, you have to feel pretty good about just your nucleus here with those two guys in particular. Now, the problem is, you have to have more around consistently. You have to have more guys that can reach that level. And that's what we talked about before is roster-wise, maybe that's the biggest thing with Vanderbilt. But at least just kind of seeing what these two guys are able to do and certainly seeing kind of what Disu has done has certainly been impressive.
Yeah, well, with Vandy, when it's won those 2 games, it's been just out of the blue outstanding performances by Max Evans and Clevon Brown. Last night, Evans gives them 2 points in 31 minutes, 1 of 4 from the field. Clevon Brown goes 4 of 5 for 8 and had a little stretch where he was a factor, but he also picked up 3 fouls, only played 18 minutes. So, again, it just, you look from those 2 guys down, nobody else hits double digits. And that's the thing is the supporting cast just isn't very good. That's the thing that everybody in Nashville is concerned about, that Stackhouse, will he be able to get enough players? And keep in mind, Disu and Pippen were not his guys. Now, he came in, they were Bryce Drew signees, and he kept them on board. He did not keep another one on. But, can he find and identify players to give him enough supporting cast? That's kind of the question. But, Blake, no games tonight. SEC games this weekend. We have got Vanderbilt goes to Alabama. Kentucky goes to Tennessee. Missouri goes to South Carolina. Georgia travels to Florida. Auburn visits LSU. And then Mississippi State goes to Ole Miss. Arkansas goes to Texas A&M, hopefully. What is the most interesting game to you out of that slate?
Oh, boy. Yeah, I mean, I think for reasons we just talked about, I think the Tennessee-Kentucky game is intriguing. I know it's not the usual Tennessee-Kentucky game we're used to, but I think to see kind of what Tennessee looks like after that offensive performance against South Carolina. So that's intriguing to me, and really to see, what Kentucky can kind of build on the rest of the way. But, I mean, I think overall, you've got a bunch of NCAA tournament teams probably playing teams that are not going to be in the NCAA tournament. I feel like that's pretty much it. Like, you don't have any of those matchups between 2 teams right now that you think are both going to be in the tournament. So I think the biggest storyline with that is, if you're a team that's going to be in the tournament, aka a Missouri, which we've talked about, has to go to play, at South Carolina, you really need a win there. And we've said it with South Carolina, you just don't ever know what you're going to get. And then, Florida having to play a team like Georgia, who just got a big win. LSU, Auburn, like, these are spots for all of these potential NCAA tournament teams, and especially Ole Miss. I mean, this is, essentially a must-win game for Ole Miss against Mississippi State. I want to say they may have moved up to like Lenardi's 5th team out, something like that at this point. So Ole Miss in a must-win spot. I mean, certainly if you're Arkansas, if you're red hot, you don't want to lose against Texas A&M. So I think that's what the biggest storyline of the weekend is going to be is, will all of these NCAA tournament teams, potentially Ole Miss too, thrown in the mix, be able to beat the teams that are not going to be in the tournament, because that if they don't, who are going to be the ones that lose and maybe hurt their resume a little bit. And I will say there's also a little bit of intrigue with the Vanderbilt at Alabama game, because that's one where I don't know. There's just I think Alabama should take care of business there, but I find it just appealing to see maybe how that game plays out from a stylistic standpoint with how those two teams play. So a lot of good games. Like, I think there are actually going to be some good games, even though, like we said, maybe there's a difference in tournament teams and non-tournament teams. But I think we should have at least some pretty good games this weekend.
Well, we have talked about how the league is just jumbled, right? Not a lot of separation after Alabama. And my goodness, when you start to look at the league numbers in conference games, get this, I've never seen anything like this that I remember. Maybe Kentucky's done it, I'm sure it has, but scoring margin, number one in the league, Alabama in conference games, plus 15.1. Number two, Arkansas, plus 3.7.
Yeah. That's what a difference, right? I mean, that's the thing is, I mean, it's one thing just to look at Alabama's record and say, all right, well, they're 12-1, and you would hope, like, at this, they're a top 10 team. You would hope people are realizing this nationally, not just people who watch the SEC, but like this is a great team. Like, they're not just a really good team that happens to be at the top of the SEC. And I've seen people out there saying, well, the SEC's down. I'm sure they're, equating that to Kentucky and all this other stuff. But it's a strong league. But Alabama is just boat racing people in a very strong league. So to me, that shows you just how great this team is and exactly what they're capable of.
Well, and it's not like Alabama has been the beneficiary of a weak schedule. Ken Palm has got them having played the sixth toughest slate in the league.
Yeah.
So there's that. But I look at that blows me away. I mean, you look everybody else. You've got 7 teams that are on the positive. You got Kentucky just under it at minus 0.8, and really you've got Missouri minus 1.7, Mississippi State minus 3.0, South Carolina minus 3.9, Vanderbilt minus 4.8. Then you drop off Georgia minus 7.1, and A&M really lagging the field at minus 12.9. But I mean, just so much parity in this league this year.
By the way, an update to our we talked about Alabama being at the very top in defensive efficiency. Someone has overtaken Alabama at the top spot, and no, it's not Tennessee, who has now moved to third as Alabama's moved to second. Loyola Chicago. So they are now number one in adjusted defensive efficiency nationally. So Alabama will be trying to get that spot back when they play Vanderbilt on Saturday.
I cannot say I would have guessed that.
Me either, but I think about it and I'm like, you talk about another team that's kind of been just blowing people out. Like, well, Chicago's been doing that at times there in the Missouri Valley. So.
Well, that's a team, and not to take too far of a detour here, but that's a squad that a lot of those younger kids on that Final Four team now are growing up. I'm sure they have benefited from recruiting to that Final Four bid. And Cameron Krutwig is a really
still there,
outstanding player. Yeah, and he seems like he's been there forever. But I mean, he's a post who can pass and shoot efficiently. And if you're making a list of the 5 guys with the skills to do a little bit of everything, he's on that short list of 4 or 5 guys nationally. But anyway, Blake, I think tomorrow there probably will not be a basketball podcast. Barry Allen and I are going to get together later today and do a mega baseball preview show that we will probably air Friday. So any parting thoughts on your end in case we don't get to you between now and the weekend?
No, should be a fun weekend of basketball. And like you said, I know you guys certainly excited. Baseball getting ready to start. We talked about all the snow and the weather and everything. So I think it'll be interesting to see kind of what the SEC baseball schedule looks like this weekend. But Chris, I've also heard a rumor that we have this website coming pretty soon too. And you and I have gotten a chance to take a look at it. And we knew it was going to be great, but you and I were sounding like little children, how giddy we were when we actually saw the website. So I think everyone should be excited for that.
Oh, it is a good-looking website. We have put a lot of resources into it. It is going to roll out in the next couple of days. Maybe, in fact, by the time you hear this, we might have it public. Probably not, but perhaps. But it is – I'll just put it this way. It is not going to look like just a fan-run blog or something. It's a legitimate sports website that's going to look really clean and professionally done, because it is. And by the way, there'd be a lot of bells and whistles that come later with that site, but we wanted to get something up and going by the start of baseball season. That was our goal all along. So I think we're going to have that. And in the meantime, the podcast is not going away. We are going to continue to do this probably 5 days a week, as long as there is something in season, whether that is football, basketball, or baseball. We will taper off probably a little bit in the summer for our sanity and maybe for yours too. But in any case, tell folks where they can find the podcast. By the way, keep the ratings coming. That really helps us as we get noticed. Helps us with a lot of things, but people have been just blown me away with our listening on it, with our ratings so far. But Blake, tell people where they can follow us on Twitter and where they can leave a rating, anything else to do to follow us and help us out as we get this thing off the ground.
Yeah, we've had a lot of great ratings thus far, so we really do appreciate that. You can do that on Apple Podcasts, of course, and Spotify, Stitcher, any podcast app you use. The podcast should be on there now. If not, just search for the 14 or Southeastern 14. You'll be able to find us on any podcast app you use. So we've got the YouTube channel if you prefer to listen to podcasts on YouTube. We'll have that, links to everything on our Twitter at 14 Southeastern. And as we discussed, when the website gets here, we'll have links, and much easier to kind of find all of our stuff in one location. If you want the podcast links, you'll be able to find that on there. If you want our written stuff, that'll be on there. So really, it's just it's been a lot of fun to get this thing going, and yeah, we really appreciated everyone's feedback thus far.
Yeah, give us a follow on Twitter, please. That's lagging our podcast listens a little bit, so let's get that boosted up a little bit so, again, more people will find us. All right, for Blake Lovell, I'm Chris Lee. Remember, again, Friday's episode should be baseball-centered, so basketball content will kick back up again on Monday. Thank you for listening. Have a great and safe weekend. We'll see you back here Friday when Barry Allen and I will have a baseball episode here at the 14.